Good afternoon and welcome to this Health Tech World Roundtable. The subject today is AI, and in particular, is it the panacea we've all been waiting for, something that really will move the future of healthcare forward in leaps and bounds. We've got a fabulous group of panellists with us today, and I'm going to ask each of them just to say a few words about themselves, their organisations, and their areas of special interest. And then we'll push on into some wider topics as part of the discussion. So in no particular order, Dan, could I start with you, please? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you again, Paul. So I'm Dan Midgley. I'm coming from Orion Health. So we are providers of world-leading technology to improve the clinician, the patient, the data experience across healthcare, and currently provide digital care records for over 18 million citizens across UK and Ireland. And my role in that is really to look at how can we unlock more value, more insights from that data and have a bigger impact on the healthcare delivery.
Great, thank you for that, Dan. Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. Thanks, Dan. So I'm Paul White, Head of AI at Answer Digital. We're a employee-owned technology consultancy up in Leeds, working with the NHS across national, regional and local level. And so our key programs being in moving care services out of hospital campuses through virtual wards and community diagnostic centres, enabling personalised medicine and treatment with whole genome sequencing. And in the last few years, we've been building an AI deployment engine and federated learning platform for the implementation and training of AI models in the NHS. We've rolled that into 7 trusts who are looking at taking a scalable and integrated approach to deploying AI. So I think my angle here is how do we expand on that and take more trusts through that AI maturity journey.
Great, and I'm sure we'll come back to those themes, Paul. Dilraj.
Thanks, Alistair. So I'm Dilraj. I'm a clinician by background. At Skin Analytics, I'm the clinical AI lead. So I'm responsible for all of the real-world evidence for how our AI as a medical device called DERM is performing. So it's a medical device that looks at dermoscopic images, which are the same kind of images that a clinician would use to assess a mole for skin cancer. It's the only UKCA Class 2A approved medical device for that use case. And for AI and dermatology as a whole, actually. But we've been in NHS pathways since 2020, and at this stage, we've seen over 80,000 patients in them in live pathways.
Great, thanks for that, Dilraj. And last but not least, Gil.
Hey, everybody. Thank you. So my name is Gil. I'm a sales manager for UK and Ireland for Sectra. And we at Sectra provide enterprise medical imaging software for the NHS globally. So it is a Swedish company. We work with a large number of NHS trusts and organizations across the UK. And in the AI sphere, what our approach to it has been is to help facilitate access to AI. So rather than develop our own kind of AI tools and solutions, our aim is to help bring those into our existing customers to speed and facilitate the adoption of AI within clinical pathways.
Great, thank you, Gil. I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to address the subject that is the title of our conversation today. Dan, is AI a panacea for healthcare? Or if not, is it critically important to the future of healthcare? And if so, why?
I think absolutely it's critical. I think as well as it becoming a bit of a notorious buzzword that's coming up in every conversation we have, there are reasons for that, and it's because it's going to be how we meet the different challenges that are facing healthcare over the next few years. Things like the shortage of clinicians, the increasing of long-term comorbidities, and increasing drive to get patients to take much more control over their care. AI is going to be the technology that helps to bridge those gaps. And I think that while we've got these kind of extreme concepts of doctor AI, I think what it's really going to do is enhance that patient AI, patient clinician relationship by ensuring clinicians have got the right data they need at the point of care to make the best decisions and to best utilise their time.
Great, thanks, Dan. Paul, same question to you. I'm going to go round all of the panelists with this question.
I agree with a lot of what Dan said there. I think we're seeing it having good impacts in radiology at the moment, and we're starting to see how it can support the implementation of secure data environments around how it can help with clinical coding and taking traditional clinical notes and letters and helping to pull out the codes and bring in standardization to that, which would be building a foundation for future AI innovation as well. So I think it could be a panacea. I think we're at the very start of that journey, and if we're putting the right building blocks in place, we should be able to keep the NHS on the cusp of innovation in this area as well.
Thanks, Paul. Dilraj.
I'll be a bit contrarian and say I think it depends. I think there's lots of potential that it has, and I think it's already starting to show some of that. I think there are sort of some specific, well-defined use cases that perhaps have more value that they can add right now that are perhaps being bunched in amongst the notion of AI, which obviously has a lot of wider connotations that we hear talked about, amongst all audiences, not necessarily health-focused ones. So I think that because there's so much talk around it, it's quite difficult to disentangle where we're going to extract the most value at the earliest opportunities. And so I think it's definitely possible, but I think some of these things might limit the ability of us to make the most of it at the earliest opportunity. So I think it probably is a case of when, but when could be a very long time if we don't get it right early.
Thanks, Dilraj. And I think we'll definitely come back to that question of timing at some point. Gil?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think there is definitely an element of timing to it all. I think what it looks like in the short term will be very different than where we inevitably end up in the long term. I've got no doubt that AI is going to be a pervasive presence in our lives, not just in healthcare but in general, in the future. However, I think, and I completely agree with Dilraj in the sense that it is important for us to identify the adequate use cases to be able to lay a good foundation of well implemented, and efficient and use cases that can demonstrate the power of AI and provide a return on investment, so to speak, whether that be in terms of money, time, or people. So certainly.
Thanks, Gil. Just opening the discussion up, and hopefully one of our panelists will sort of pick this up and we can open up the discussion. I think it would be really interesting for all those watching to get an understanding of where you think AI can make the greatest impact in terms of patient access or patient care. Your point, Dan, that point where clinicians and patients meet, but productivity. And just as importantly, where doesn't AI have a role to play, and where the more traditional methods still have to hold sway in the future. So thoughts on that, for people watching, where do we think the big benefits are that can be accessed relatively quickly?
I think that in terms of bringing patients closer to their own care, the use of natural language processing, large language models, so that we can take all of that rich data that's contained in the comprehensive patient records and make it accessible and understandable to them, so that they can be an active participant in what's going on and make better decisions and contribute to their care, and help them look at alternative models of care that they want to participate in, especially in terms of trying to get people to be cared for closer to home. I think that's going to be crucial. And equally, that taking that same concept and how we can summarize complex patient data into bite-sized chunks for clinicians to increase productivity. We're going to really increase the capacity that we've got to deliver care, and probably a good point for me to pause before I could ramble on for hours about the different exciting topics that we want to look into.
But that whole idea of self-care and people taking a bit more responsibility for their own health data, I think is something that everybody's nodding their heads at, and probably people can't quite understand why there isn't one data platform so that you give a piece of information once and everybody that needs access can access it.
And I think with a lot of the digital care record programs that we're working with, that is going to be the next step of how do you put in the right controls around IG and privacy, but how do you stop also duplicating multiple flows of data so you've got a really rich repository that can be used at the right source in the right context at the right time. And that's definitely the journey that we're going on with our partners.
Any thoughts from any of the other panelists about where you think the big wins are, if you like, with AI at a relatively early stage, and where there are areas that are much more sensitive and people might actually prefer AI not to be involved in some areas?
I think in terms of the quickest win in AI, and where certainly a lot of the national funding is being funneled, it is into radiology and in particular into sort of chest imaging as well. So tackling those cancer 2-week waits and reducing those waiting lists, I think that might be the quickest route for impact in AI. There's over 200 applications CE marked, and also we're in those early stages of the AI deployment funding going out to the imaging networks as well. So I think in the next couple of years, I'd hope that's where we start seeing some tangible impact on those waiting lists.
I can follow up on that one because I think there's a similar picture in dermatology insofar as, you know, an excessive and growing burden of skin cancer referrals versus a workforce that hasn't got enough capacity to handle that volume. And so, you know, dermatology, skin conditions in general are one of the most common reasons that anyone seeks medical care. I see that as an area that, you know, that's essentially why we need to exist to help alleviate and prioritize patients for those clinicians to be able to see the right people at the earliest opportunity. I kind of like to come back to the overall question that you started with, Alistair, because I think there's some broad themes there that are worth unpacking. So in terms of sort of longer term, what are the things that I don't think we can do anytime soon, or if at all? I think anything that requires a clinical examination physically or a procedure to be done, that it's very hard to see how that could ever be like AI. It could be AI maybe enhanced, perhaps. Maybe there's some things in the operating room that can be done. But I think that largely speaking, that's an area that is less likely to have as much of an AI influence. I think things along the diagnostic pathway that have a potentially huge one. I also think things along the lines of titration of treatments, particularly for long-term conditions. Many of them have treatments that you may want to up titrate or down titrate, and that could be a bit more dynamic according to parameters that clinicians perhaps set. And I think there's an opportunity there to start even thinking more about, we don't necessarily wean patients off medications often enough as doctors. And so you often end up with patients and they come in multi-morbidity, multiple medications in A&E at the age of 75. It's very hard to disentangle what's going on with them amongst the multiple conditions. So I think the opportunities in terms of treatments and sort of titrating them to where they need to be is actually quite substantial. But I think perhaps the quickest of the wins, just because of the complexity in terms of getting to the right kind of AI working and with the right approvals, medical device regulations, enough validation of it, I think actually some of the quicker wins could be in clinical workflows. So some more of the administrative side, perhaps getting people to be able to write their patient letters quicker. Clinical coding, as you mentioned, Paul, I think that's a huge one. And I think there's sort of more of there'll be a human in the loop at those parts of the workflow anyway. And so it makes it a bit quicker to innovate. Whereas a lot of the other wins that we need to look for when it comes to diagnostics and treatment are actually, we just don't have enough clinicians. And so we have to find a way of being able to enable patients to receive their care that doesn't rely as much on clinical capacity. So I think that is where the biggest win is in terms of diagnostics and treatment. But I think the quickest is perhaps more on the workflow side.
No, yeah, if I can, I'll start to kind of build on that as well. Is that I very much agree in terms of, I think, and this is perhaps turning the question more into what are the barriers for bigger wins. But I think, you know, in terms of that human in the loop element, I establishing the governance to allow for the human to come out of the loop is going to be a challenge, and it's one of the that's again happening not just in healthcare, but if you look at self-driving cars and all of that, that is how do we untangle that? How do we resolve that issue of not having necessarily a human making decisions for us? I feel like a lot of these wins, a lot of these algorithms are very capable. A lot of these specialties have very clear use cases. If you think of breast screening, for example, there's a very clear use case there. They're being read by 2 humans in some countries, and in some, and I know the UK is looking into that as well, but there have been trials where you can fully replace one of those humans by an AI algorithm, and they do really well. But it is just about setting that governance. So I think the quickest wins for the immediate term are going to be where there isn't a necessity to have a human in the loop. There isn't it isn't a clinical decision. It isn't a diagnostic decision, but it is augmentation of something, whether that be in aiding writing reports or summarizing clinical, something that has aids efficiency and builds and allows the clinicians to act more efficiently without necessarily having an input in the diagnosis as well, because that is going to be another question entirely. I think we'll get there, but it is a trickier path.
Thanks, Gil. Can we maybe stay with that theme of what the barriers are to adoption and acceleration of the use of AI? Is it about regulation or the lack of regulation and a clear understanding of the role that AI should be playing?
I mean, if I might continue for briefly, I won't take too long. But I think that is one that we need to there's been studies and there's been surveys of particularly in again going back to breast screening, but there have been surveys of people where you ask the population whether they're happy for their studies to be read by an AI, and they range. So it is an education as much as anything else. But when you ask people, when you present it in such a way that would you be happy that if it was one of the reads was done by AI, if it means you get your results much quicker, or we can increase the screening intervals, or we can store, all of these things have a trade-off, right? So that I think it is a regulatory question. It is as a society, we need to understand how are we going to handle it, or how are we going to deal with AI in general. But there's also some of the barriers that need to be, particularly in the imaging side, which is where I'm what I'm most familiar with. There is the integration side. There is who holds the images. There is a technology barrier of data. Where is data held? How is it going to get to the AI algorithm for processing? Are we deploying a lot of boxes on premises? Are we doing a lot of forwarding to the cloud? And if we are, how is that patient data? How is that going to flow? So there are a number of barriers. Many of them are completely, we are completely capable of overcoming, but they need to be considered.
I can pick up on some of the themes I'm hearing and perhaps elaborate on the one I feel is most poignant. So I think at its core, I think this is all about trust. And I think the various factors that contribute to that, the regulatory side of it might be one of them, but I think from a regulatory perspective, I think lots of regulators are very proactively defining what they feel is necessary for AI to be running at an appropriate level. As an organization that's achieved a Class 2A status, enabling an autonomous use of our device, that's something that we feel is clear, and we are trying to work with them even to define higher standards for things like post-market surveillance. And I think that's an important thing to continue evolving and working with. There's always going to be that grapple between sort of regulation and technology evolving and how quick they are able to keep up with that. But I think what I'm seeing is sort of, there's themes in what you said, Gil, around like sort of patient trust in AI, trust in the kind of regulatory environment to keep up with it, even sort of down to individual clinician trust of an AI operating in their environment. And so I think it's interesting to consider each of them, because from a patient perspective, I think a lot of assumptions are made about how patients feel about aspects of their care. I've seen this a lot in other digital transformation roles, but we did a study at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. We published it last year in Frontiers, and we found similar things to what you're describing, Gil, whereby patients were amenable to the use of AI in their skin cancer care, particularly if it was as opposed to waiting for a few weeks for a specialist appointment. And so that it's the trade-off conundrum for patients. But if we don't ask them, we don't get to know how they really feel. I think from a clinician perspective, I think there's so much talk and chatter about AI more widely, about who's going to be replaced and how. I think that's done a disservice to how much progress we could have made by now, because it might not enter the conversations explicitly, but it does play a role in how much you can sort of collaborate and get on the same side and really come to a common understanding of what you're trying to achieve. The regulatory side, I think, is going to continue to evolve, but I think it's really important for us as an industry to be really clear about what we think what we think and know now, and are able to sort of educate everyone as we go along. And I think a massive part of that story is validating that it is performing as we say it does in the real world environment, and continuing to discuss that openly.
Do you sense that there is some resistance amongst clinicians, Dilraj, to adopting some of the newer uses of AI?
Yes, but I don't think this is a new thing. Like, novel technologies have come and have over time been integrated in healthcare over years. So in our domain, dermoscopes, which are the devices that clinicians will look at moles with now, weren't initially embraced. Teledermatology, so just the notion of virtually reviewing a case, seems relatively simple and seems like it should have been, particularly post-COVID, like the norm, but it's not necessarily been. Ultimately, change does take time. In healthcare, we've got many stakeholders to think about, many of whom are in between innovators and patients, and so it can take that time to filter through. But everyone has to be able to win at the end of the day. So it's one of those things where it can take time, and it is a barrier for now. And also, they're naturally time poor. So the opportunities to actually come to that common understanding, spend enough time together looking at the content of what's going on and what you're proposing, that's quite difficult to find. So it's just going to be the same capacity problem that kind of limits us making that progress.
I think it's really important to build that into the implementation journey. Like you're saying, it takes time. I mean, we can't just bung it in. Where we can create that capacity amongst the time poor clinicians to be able to assess, quality assure, and get comfortable with the AI before rolling it straight into the middle of a clinical workflow. I think that's really important, and that heart and mind's journey, so that they understand the place of AI in that clinical pathway. It's assisting, not replacing them, and it's giving them more time with patients, maybe taking some of the admin burden off. I think we've got to be building that into the implementation timelines of what we're talking about. It will lead to a more effective implementation of AI at the end of it.
Dan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose that I'm looking at this from a system readiness level, and that end-to-end embracing AI at scale. There was a survey in the US that found that only 6% of healthcare organizations have an AI strategy. And having that strategic approach to embracing AI means that you can have the right controls over the data. It means you can have the resilience when AI becomes a part of your key business processes, that if a data source or a clinical system is replaced, that it doesn't fall over, that you can manage any risks and sort of training issues as you go along. So I think it does, we're going to get some real exciting pockets of innovation, but I think it's taking that strategic top level view that's going to be quite key.
Just picking up that point, Dan, about governments or trusts or organisations maybe not having a plan for AI. I think everybody here is UK-based, although you might have global interests. What's your feeling about whether or not the UK government, or indeed the Scottish government, have a clear approach to how they use AI, given the pressure on health-based budgets? I think everybody's very focused on how to do more with potentially a little bit less, given relatively flat healthcare budgets. Do you think governments in Westminster and Holyrood have a clear sense that this is a big opportunity to make health budgets go further and do more?
I mean, particularly in light of yesterday's announcement, I think there's definitely an ambition, expectation that AI can be the answer to increasing productivity and doing more. I think that what we're probably seeing is that more of that how is being influenced at a local and a regional level. I think if you speak to a lot of different leaders, they've probably got different areas that they can identify where administrative processes can be replaced by different AI functions, and it's probably also worth bearing in mind that when we do talk about AI, it's got such a broad range of meanings that it could be referring to. So it could be algorithms that help you to target the right care. It could be RPA to focus on certain administrative tasks. So I think, yeah, definitely there is a top level excitement of what it can deliver, but locally directed is probably what we're seeing.
I think to pick up on that as well, there is excitement, there is funding in that area, and Dan, I think your point of that is so broad. I think what we're seeing, where we're seeing the funding being placed, isn't on building foundations to accept that broadness. You're seeing it funneled into singular models, and not, which is costly and point-to-point integrations, which obviously you guys at Orion will know a lot about. I don't think that funding is enabling us to move outside of what sort of the buzzwords are now. We know digital pathology is around the corner, genomics is around the corner. All of the funding coming out, it has been focused on chest CT and X-ray, and I just wonder whether we're making mistakes that we've made in other sectors in the past with regards to vendor lock-in, and not keeping us enabled to future innovation.
I was going to say, sort of thinking about I spent a bit of time in the US last year, thinking about sort of how AI fits in there. But I feel like in terms of the UK, and I get that there's an excitement, and that might be a desire to run too fast with some of this. But equally, I think what we have in the UK healthcare system is essentially the selection pressure is cost-effective care, because we have that fully public system. And so it is one that more sort of naturally addresses that mismatch in terms of how much clinical capacity we have versus the demand coming from patients. And so it's probably going to be one of those, it seems very much so already, that appetite to address that and the opportunity that AI offers in general, and the principle of that being, prioritization and appropriate prioritization of patients, means that clinical time can be distributed better, makes probably the UK, as far as I've seen so far, a world leader in actually embracing the potential of it. We've seen that in sort of the National Stroke Program already, the ability to be able to prioritize CT scans for stroke patients. And so and we're seeing that starting to happen in our space now, with some funding sort of focused on skin cancer pathways and dermatology in general, which is one of the biggest sort of referral burdens in the country. So I think there's slight overlap of themes here, because Dan and Paul, I think you're talking more to sort of a systemic overarching access across all data points, and perhaps some sort of like means of accessing different types of AI. I think there's probably two things that need to happen in tandem, which is what I think you guys are interested in, but also each of those clinically driven things is going to be, we're going to have to sort of prioritize those as well, and say that these are the ones that we need to focus on now. What I feel like I've seen in the US environment, where obviously things are a bit more devolved and more private as a system, is that there's been probably a lot more uptake of that clinical workflow type AI, sort of organization by organization. I think it's going to take them longer to embrace the sort of diagnostics and so forth, and the sort of bigger capacity gains where you're able to not have a human in the loop.
Just moving on, talk a little bit about research and innovation. Where's that taking place? Is it coming out of universities? Is it coming out of private companies? Are there effective public-private partnerships? And I suppose that's the sort of nub of my question. Have we got public and private sector working together effectively to generate research and innovation that makes a difference, and makes a difference quickly?
So I'll start and then swiftly hand over. But I think from our perspective, we work so as a like I said at the very start, we are working with various providers of AI solutions as an aggregator, if you will, to facilitate adoption for our customers. And the vast majority of the aggregators that we work are private companies that may have spun out of research and university development, but by and large they are startup companies. They are new entrants to the market that are coming up with incredible solutions. And they are global, so they're not necessarily just in the UK. But we recognize the importance of these research centers and these universities. And one of the things we've been trying to do lately is to expand the use case of our aggregator as well, to be able to, for our customers that we provide our systems to that have universities, and there are or research centers, and there's a number of them. We want them to be able to use that pathway in our systems and publicly available frameworks and open source frameworks to also deploy their own homebrew and home developed systems in order to speed up the adoption of those systems to the market. Essentially trying to, again, remove some barriers of entry, that because you may have a very good AI algorithm, but to get that into production is a whole different story. So we're trying to essentially speed up the speed with which these universities and research centers can do so as well. It is there's ample opportunity for collaboration there, and a lot of these startups are spinning out of universities and research centers, but it's still that very early stage of the market for this.
I think for all those people watching, sorry, Dilraj, were you going to come in there?
Yeah, it's an interesting one to ask where it's coming from. I think it can come from all of those pockets that have already been described. I think it's one of those things where things are obviously moving very rapidly in this AI space, and I think there's opportunity to take learnings from all of them. I feel that when it comes to sort of some of the elements, when you get into the academic world, don't necessarily focus on what we need to be doing for patients now in a real world environment, and that can limit our ability to really move in the right direction at the pace that the needs in healthcare require us to. So it's a delicate balancing act from my perspective. I think there are things that we have to solve for much quicker in an industry environment because we're delivering that care collaboratively with providers now, that I think if we took if we stayed in the academic aspect of that too long, then we wouldn't be delivering as much for the patients that we need to. And so that means that things like for us, when we've started sort of the first prospective study for AI in melanoma detection, we started that in 2015 across 7 UK skin cancer pathways. We didn't publish it until 2019. Similarly, the study I mentioned before, at Chelsea and Westminster, we weren't able to publish some of that until last year. So all of that data is kind of there, and we're doing that collaboratively. But I think there can sometimes be a bit of a mismatch between what you're able to disseminate academically versus the value you're able to deliver now. And we need to be able to get that balance right as well to make sure that patients are able to access the best care available to them at the earliest opportunities.
I think just to build on that point of collaboration, I think that we are seeing a much more mature approach to collaboration and innovation now, where perhaps 15 years ago, health tech providers were probably quite suspicious of each other. I think with funding pressures and the need for innovation more than ever, we're now seeing better collaboration as part of a health ecosystem, so that different suppliers can work together to ensure that you're delivering more value to the customer. But at the same time, empowering healthcare organisations to bring their own innovation using the technology that we're bringing to the table. So I think you'll find that there's ongoing sort of innovation just from within the health ecosystem, from these new relationships that are being built between suppliers.
Thanks, Dan. Paul?
Yeah, I think part of the question you asked, Alistair, was whether we're seeing that research and innovation leading to sort of more deployment. And I think that's where there's a bit of a gap. It's similar to Gil. We're working with a number of model vendors who are partnering with university hospitals and doing some brilliant trials. And I think sort of taking it from trial into frontline care is that there's a gap there at the moment, and how we incentivize and enable that, I think is an area to focus on, because I don't think the hit rate is particularly successful at the moment.
I do just want to bring one point in relation to that, though, that I think is really key here. So absolutely, you shouldn't be deploying anything without that clinical research study to understand what the effect and efficacy could be. But there is a small but growing literature base that AI, when taken from a research environment into a real world one, that the performance can drop. And so it's not just it's a continuous journey of evolving understanding. So post-market surveillance, when it comes to AI, is really key to making sure that you are still delivering at the level that you've shown in your clinical studies.
Yeah, I mean, we're a big fan of post-market surveillance at the moment as well, and got a keen eye on that. And I think that I see that in sort of two tranches as well. So there's obviously a regulatory responsibility of the model vendor to know how their model is performing. And as this area of surveillance evolves, I'm really keen for the trust to retain that data as well, to see how it's impacting clinical care, and if successfully, how they can use that data to build business cases for future investment in AI. I think surveillance is a critical part of the next couple of years for sure.
Dilraj used the phrase real world impact. It would be quite nice to just get a couple examples of where AI is currently working and delivering real world impact, if anybody has any.
I mean, for us, as I've said, we've seen 80,000 patients in our pathways now. We've kind of it's part of a pathway where there's also teledermatology virtual reviews by dermatologists as well after the AI assessment. So we've seen that roughly a third of those patients can be eligible for discharge after the AI assessment. We've seen that combining that with teledermatology downstream means that 2/3 of people can avoid face-to-face appointments in sort of that urgent pathway and be routed to either not requiring any further care, to other specialties as appropriate, to non-urgent pathways, or even straight to procedure. So those are the sorts of things that we're seeing sort of service level. And then, yeah, the current version of the AI is sort of 97% sensitive, 99 or 100% in all of the sites that we work in, accurate when it's ruling out cancer. So those are the sorts of things that we've been able to extract because we've got a really thorough post-market surveillance program. Similarly, sort of published on that last year in terms of what we feel the post-market surveillance should be for AI as a medical device in general. I think that's, as Paul's alluded to already, I think it's one of those things where you get to have a local understanding of what's happening with that device as well. And the opportunities collaboratively to keep improving. It's also a mechanism for clinical teams to understand what's going on in all the cases in their system. I think one of the things that has been challenging or can be challenging at times is that when you have got that raft of data that you can see exactly what the accuracy is of what's going on in these pathways, clinicians who are not used to seeing population health data are then thrust into decision-making positions. And that can make it really tricky because there are a lot of assumptions made about how comfortable clinicians are with different types of information. And it's not necessarily part of training to do that. You know, you go through med school, you do your years as a clinician, and then when you're a consultant, you have all these other managerial responsibilities that may enter the fray. And it's not the same thing as looking at population health statistics, of which you only do a couple of weeks at med school. So there's kind of multiple levels of an education journey for us to contend with and amongst it all. And I think not least this sort of the statistical side of it, because of the unknowns, it's really important to be open and transparent about that. But there's also, it takes time for everyone to get onto the same understanding of all of that information as well.
Thanks, Dilraj. Any other nice, simple examples of where AI is being deployed and generating a real-world impact, Dan?
I think to just bring a different example from the diagnostics and algorithmic approaches, we've started to see some really interesting results with partners in North America that using the data layer that we can provide, they're looking at generative AI to provide those intelligent patient summaries that are tailored to staff role. But also, and Dilraj, this is in relation to your point, actually supporting with that self-service analytics, taking natural language questions to apply it to the data sets, and then also prompting what is the next question that should be asked. And this is going to be a fundamental part of that transition to AI being just business as usual.
Thanks, Dan. Any more, Paul or Gil?
I mean, I've mentioned imaging a couple of times, I think, and a lot of the model vendors now have some great use cases around cancer spotting. I was talking to one of our vendor partners today around trauma as well, and where they see an ability to come into a trust and help prevent litigation down the line of missed traumas, and that they would have saved hundreds of thousands of pounds on certain use cases that went to settlement. So yeah, I think imaging, chest, trauma, we're seeing a lot of really mature model vendors in that area and obtaining CE mark, FDA approved.
Yeah, and to pick up on that and to cap it off, essentially, we've we're now seeing those successful tenders out of the AI Diagnostics Fund for chest NCT, chest X-ray and CT that are now coming into deployment. Some of those we'd already had some of those networks are our customers, and we had already done pilots with them for similar use cases. So that's a very clear use case that's being pushed quite firmly from the NHS. But there are others. There's fracture detection, as you know, bringing it into that trauma that's currently used at some of our customers, particularly in A&E out of hours, where there may not always be that easy access to a consultant, and that just provides that additional kind of layer of comfort if somebody has some questions as to whether this is a fracture or not, when it's trickier to spot. But also there's been a study published in The Lancet last year, I believe, where one of the, as I said, and I kind of, there was a little bit of a spoiler before to this particular example, but where they've removed the human reader from that second reader process, and they've replaced it with an AI, and that from memory, I think it showed something like a 44% workload reduction, which is huge. So that, you know, those studies are now looking to be replicated in the UK. Whether retrospectively or prospectively, I'm not sure it's decided yet, but there is certainly an aim to try and bring that to trial into the UK as well, which is really exciting. So there's a lot of areas where this, you know, we're also working a lot with in terms of improving our solutions and our systems in order to build towards that verification workflow where there may be a result. This may be automated. A lot of it may be automated, but it turns the human action from a full diagnosis into I agree or disagree, or a correction, and then picking up on what Dilraj said, that then gets fed back into a post analysis that we can determine whether the model's being effective. It's because, as you say, whether you apply it to when you apply it to different population, and this could be, you know, regionally from a country perspective, these models can vary depending on the population they're targeting. So it's really important to make sure you are continuously monitoring the outcomes, really, to make sure it's doing what it said it would.
Thanks, Gil. That's a good range of real-world examples there. Just as we start to move towards a conclusion of the discussion that we've had today, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to have a think about one very specific opportunity or big priority that they think will be central to making a real difference to the lives of patients, or indeed to the progress being made by trusts or organisations involved in healthcare as a result of AI. So I'll go around the panel again in the order that we started, and I'm afraid you're first, Dan. And, you know, for you, if you were to pick one big opportunity or priority that people should be getting excited about at the moment with reference to AI?
I mean, I think that the real exciting topic is AI as a whole. It is going to be a game changer for healthcare. And if we think of the concept of bringing petabytes of data to a clinician's fingertips for improved decision making, it's hard to get our heads around. but we need to have the right data infrastructure in place to properly embrace it and accelerate it at the pace we want it to go.
Thanks, Dan. Paul, final thoughts?
Yes, for me, it's how do we bring equity of access to AI-enhanced treatment, lowering those barriers of entry for any size trust to adopt AI, and with that the quality and consistency that up to treatment that will bring. No matter what time you turn up to A&E or wherever, you'll have that same consistency of the AI running throughout.
Thanks, Paul. Dilraj?
Finding it a bit tricky to find a neat summary point here, Alistair, but I think for me, one of the key things to think about in this space is that all AI is not the same. And I think it's quite important for us to be really clear on what we're trying to achieve with it and be able to sort of look at each of those AI tools and with the appropriate rigor for what it's trying to do. I think for those clinical workflow things that we talked about, or more of the administrative workflows, we don't need to worry as much about sort of how accurate they are, because someone's always going to finalize the outcome of that anyway. It's more administrative. I think for those sort of diagnostic ones, we sort of think about AI as this whole bucket, and it comes with all of the things that you've read about in the news and so forth. But that doesn't mean that a regulated AI as a medical device is that same kind of phenomenon. And so it's much more akin in terms of when you look at it and assess it to any other test that we would use, and the stats that you would interpret are the same. So I think we need to be able to look at that with a common language, and I think that's more akin to diagnostics in general, or other treatments in general. And I think that's really important for us to get to a common vernacular that we can navigate the information much more effectively together.
Hey, that was a great summary, Dilraj. Thank you. And last word, Gil.
I'm glad that I was last, because it gave me some time to think about this. But I think, and at the risk of upsetting some of my radiologist friends and colleagues, I am particularly excited about digital pathology and what AI can bring to that field. I think, there's a lot of talk about radiology, and rightly so. There's a lot of opportunities there, but I think for digital pathology, it's a whole world. One, we're just going digital, so we're opening up that field as a start, or just in the last decade or so. But also, there's the nature of the images lends itself to a lot of interesting things being possible with AI for digital pathology as well, and to translate more directly into efficiencies. But I think the main thing is that we're still in that realm of looking. We're looking for, it's like when Henry Ford came up with the car, everybody wanted just a faster horse. And I think we're still looking for faster horses. And I think the world is going to change around us, and we don't even know what the opportunities are in a lot of ways. There's AI, and the AI will see things and images that we cannot, and the human beings are not looking at at this very moment. So I think it's a really exciting field, and in the near term, there are going to be some really exciting developments that might just transform the way we look at things.
Thank you, Gil. And there we have it. If AI isn't a panacea, as Dan said, it definitely will be a game changer, even if that's not going to happen tomorrow. And it's fantastic to have heard so many examples of where AI is already making a big difference to people's lives and their health destinies as well. I'd just like to take this opportunity on behalf of Health Tech World to thank our panelists, who have been fabulous, and thank you for sharing your experience, your knowledge, and your vision, and how you think things will develop during the days and weeks and months and years ahead. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Please share this as widely as possible. It deserves to be seen by as many people as possible. So once again, thank you on behalf of Health Tech World. I'm sure we'll have future discussions and debates as AI continues to develop its influence. And thanks once again to all of our panelists. Thank you.